Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name's James Harding. I'm editor and co-founder of Tortoise. And I start with a confession, which is that I woke up at 5:37 this morning, excited that we were hosting a ThinkIn on where we are in the Brexit negotiations. Excited chiefly because I'm deeply confused. I'm confused about what a deal could look like, what the scale of it might be, what the likelihood is of no deal, what the implications are for the politics in the UK, for the shape of the UK itself, for the relationship with the European Union, for future trade negotiations. And the reason that sometimes I feel really fortunate to be doing what we're doing here at Tortoise is that we've built, I hope, a mechanism that when you've got an issue that's in front of you that you deeply don't understand, you can bring people in who will help you understand it. And we're incredibly lucky this morning that Georgina Wright from the Institute for Government, Marley Morris from the ippr, that mighty think tank, and Seb Dance, who has been in the heart of UK's relationship with Europe as a former Labour MEP, are here to join us. As you know, the nature of a ThinkIn is that actually we want to be informed by everyone who's in the room, or in this case, in our digital room. My colleague Matt Dancona is here, and as well as be marshalling the chat this morning, I'm hoping that Matt will weigh in on how he sees and reads what's happening in British politics, particularly within the Conservative Party. And I'm hoping I'm going to find my colleague Chris Cook, who has spent more time, walking the pavements of Whitehall, and bring him in too. So what we're going to do this morning, unlike some ThinkIns, is we're going to start and just try and get, if you like, briefed back into the story by Georgina, Marley and Seb, and then bring in as many members as possible with views on how the government's handling it, but specifically also what the implications are for where we are in the Brexit negotiations. I'm sure everyone knows their way around Zoom, but I'm just going to remind you, do weigh in on the chat. It'd be great to hear you. I already see that we've got someone from Berlin. Good morning, Mark Dempsey from Berlin. It'd be brilliant to hear your view and how it looks from there. But everyone's opinions and insights on this is really valued. We've got an hour, and so I'm going to ask Georgina to kick off, if you wouldn't mind, Georgina. I guess, can you just take us very gently back into Brexit? I suppose we've been deep in COVID for the better part of 6 months, and it's just really helpful to understand where we are, what the state of negotiations are, and really, Georgina, what's on the negotiating table now?
Great, thank you, James, and thank you everyone for being here this morning. I mean, the reality is that sure, Brexit hasn't been in the news, but it's absolutely been ongoing. I mean, negotiations have been ongoing since January. Of course, they're not going particularly well. I mean, to a certain extent, the Brexit drama over the weekend isn't entirely a surprise. I mean, we know that on the 1st of January, our trading relationship, but also our security relationship, you know, everything from sort of law and justice, a police enforcement corporation, all of that will change on the 1st of January. So we know that those months before were always going to be really strained. And so to a certain extent, it's not totally surprising that negotiators are now at this crunch point where they're like, well, shall we carry on, or shall we just let go and start preparing for a no-deal outcome? So where are we? We know that today the 8th round of negotiations is starting in Brussels. Was it in London? I forget. Anyway, they're starting, negotiators are meeting, hopefully going to make progress, although most analysts agree that progress is unlikely this week. We know that there are significant stumbling blocks, one being state aid, the other fisheries, which I'm sure we'll come back to. And there's a real question here about how far negotiators can move, because of course they are constrained by their mandate. And so unless there's sort of intervention at the very top saying, do you know what, yes, go ahead, move from that significantly, there's not much they can do. So at the moment, you've got both sides looking at each other in the eye, knowing they have to move if they want to reach a deal, but not wanting to be the first one to move because for fear that they will lose leverage further down the line. So,
and Georgina, will you just tell us what's on the negotiating table? Because over time, I confess I've lost track of what's actually still being negotiated. And I suppose really importantly, what's not any longer being negotiated.
So That's also a really, really good question, because in reality, if you look at sort of their timetable, they're negotiating everything from sort of trading goods to trading services to energy corporation to what they call other issues, which means, British researchers, being able to work with EU researchers, but it's very difficult to unpick and to know where there has been progress. And that's partly because of the EU. The EU has said we can only make significant progress if we've made progress across all these little areas, whereas the UK's approach has been, let's just move on where we can make progress and then, leave those other bits until the very end. But the EU are looking at that and thinking, well, no, because what if we get to the end and we haven't actually addressed all those finicky issues that we really care about, then what do we do? So in a sense, it's very difficult to know where there has been progress. The only thing that I can say is basically everything is on the table, because for the past 46 years, our trading relationship, but our way of doing things has been so embedded in the EU model. So untangling that takes time.
Okay. So, Georgina, you're right. I think we're going to come back. Let's come back to state aid and fisheries, and we'll come back to the internal market bill and the arguments that have blown up over the last few days. But Marley Morris, can I bring you in? Marley, I know that I love your title. I know that you're responsible for immigration and for trade and for EU relations. I mean, that'll keep you busy. Would you just pick up, Marley, from where Georgina left off? I know that in principle, nothing is settled until it's settled, but the impression you get is that the nature of the deal is narrowing, that we're looking more at goods and less at services, that there are whole sectors of the economy that are not going to be touched by any deal, even if it's done. Can you give us a read on where you think things now look like they're headed, on the specifics of anything that might be agreed?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think over the past few years, we've had many conversations about the precise nature of the future relationship between the UK and the EU. We had the debates about single market versus customs union versus free trade agreement. Now, I think largely speaking, that is now settled. The broad contours of the relationship is in terms of the negotiations is likely to be a free trade agreement rather than single market or customs union. Obviously, there's still a possibility of a no deal altogether, but really the negotiations are now relatively focused on this specific outcome of a free trade agreement. And that means effectively that some of the conversations around, for instance, passporting of financial services, whether we would continue to have free movement of people, those are effectively decided. We're not having that close relationship anymore. We're not having something even remotely close to membership of the single market or membership of the customs union. And that means regardless of the outcome of the negotiations, if we have a no deal versus if we do get a deal, ultimately a lot of the impacts for businesses are going to be the same. We're going to see new customs controls. We're going to see new non-tariff barriers. We're going to see the UK leaving things like REACH, the system for regulating chemicals. We're going to see barriers when it comes to agri-food trade. So in a sense, a lot of the big decisions about what the future relationship between the UK and the EU has effectively been decided. There are going to be really big trade barriers in future. What a lot of this comes down to now is, can we avoid tariffs on goods? Because that's really the big win, I suppose, of the free trade agreement, and the real difference between a no deal and the kind of Canada style free trade deal. So really, yes, there's still details in other parts of the negotiations around how we can facilitate some customs arrangements, obviously some elements around justice and security, which are important. But I think that's the key win for both sides now is, can we maintain an arrangement which removes tariffs on goods?
And Marley, forgive me if I'm slightly at the CBeebies end of this particular debate, but so I understand that correctly, essentially the deal that we're now focused on is fundamentally about goods rather than services. It's about customs and tariffs, if I understand it, around things, actual things that we might make here and send there, or vice versa. Is that a reasonable, I know, simplification, is that a reasonable simplification of the main focus of the negotiations now?
Yeah, I think so. And obviously, there are negotiations on services as well, but traditionally, a kind of standard Canada style or South Korea style free trade agreement don't make huge arrangements around services. Yes, there are some arrangements around ensuring that, for instance, there's no discrimination between different service providers based on country of origin. But the kind of major deal on services is very rarely seen in trade agreements around the world. And then, of course, the classic example is the single market, because that ensures full access to services and free trade in services. So that's quite an unusual arrangement. And the only way that there was ever going to be a real significant deal on services is if the UK had said, look, we basically want a kind of single market relationship where we're willing to have, for instance, the free movement of people. Once that was ruled out, there was never going to be really much of a deal on services.
Right. So if I work on the principle then that we've got to an understanding that, and the financial services industry, if you speak to people in the city, they've clearly been expecting for some time there wouldn't be financial services in this deal, there wouldn't be passporting, and they've made or begun to make arrangements accordingly. I see that Tom Schuler on the call is asking about mutual recognition of professional qualifications. So, some of these issues, I imagine, are really significant for people in terms of their movement to do business. But is your understanding, Marley, that at the moment the real focus is that even issues like that are unlikely to be addressed?
Yeah, so I was actually thinking whilst I was speaking, the only aspect of trade and services that probably is still being discussed is mutual recognition of qualifications, and obviously some arrangements potentially around provision of kind of short-term temporary services. So, for instance, making provisions for people to be able to travel to the EU on short-term visits, and vice versa to provide services. So yeah, there are some agreements, but the kind of the big wins around passporting, around ensuring that you have freedom of establishment.
Sorry, Marley, will you just explain what passporting is, just so everyone knows?
Yeah, I mean, I think effectively just an arrangement which basically means that financial services effectively have a passport into the EU, so they don't need to establish themselves, establish subsidiaries in the EU in order to be able to trade easily in the EU. They can trade from the UK and without having to set up those bases in the EU. But as you've said, James, they've actually already, many of these financial companies have already actually set up bases in the EU in preparation for these changes already. So I think a lot of the big services companies probably have made the preparations and probably don't stand to be massively affected compared to some of the big manufacturers, say, where I think a deal really would make a difference.
And Marley, I don't know, Tortoise, we have this relationship with the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry. So we do these regular calls with them, and I was doing one yesterday with Martin McTague from the Federation of Small Business. What was really striking listening to Martin was that he was saying, and obviously his focus is on small businesses, he was saying, look, the reality is that small businesses are really already facing unprecedented pressures given COVID. They've got these waves of pressures coming. So some individuals have got the end of mortgage holidays, we're ending the job retention scheme, the furlough scheme at the end of October. And then they're forecasting as many as 750,000 small businesses failing in the first quarter of 2021, partly because VAT and national insurance contributions, all these things come due. I wonder whether when you stand back and you look at the impact, even of the deal, if the deal is done, how it falls between big corporations, big companies and small ones. Because when I think about banks and financial services or aviation and airlines or chemicals and pharma, these industries are all going to be most likely excluded from any deal, even if it were done. But the real people, it seems to me, who are most likely to be affected are those smaller and sole traders. And I wonder how you think those companies can and should be preparing for this now.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the smaller companies clearly have had a lot on their plate when it comes to COVID. And I think the government's communication campaign to try and get businesses to prepare has obviously been kind of extremely challenging under the current circumstances. I think they're going to ramp up their communications over the next few months. But the reality is that I think a lot of businesses aren't prepared. They haven't, obviously the kind of the stockpiling, which was planned earlier, have really been run down by the COVID crisis. And also there've been so many false starts because there was the risk of no deal a number of times last year. So I think that's created challenges. And I think really a lot of businesses still don't necessarily know exactly what the future arrangements will be, haven't necessarily got the kind of systems in place, the customs systems in place, the kind of plans or paperwork lined up to be able to start arranging plans for instance, exporting goods to the EU. So I think there is a real risk that with so much on their plates at the moment, businesses really struggle to adapt to the new systems once we reach January next year.
Okay, Marley, thank you. I'm going to bring in Seb Dance because Seb, you've lived this life as a member of the European Parliament. Can I ask you to do us two things, Seb? The first is to give us the big picture, i.e., putting aside the impacts on small or big businesses, what the implications are for future relationships and the development of the relationship with the European Union if we don't do a deal, how that you read that will be taken in Europe. And then I'm going to ask you a little bit about the internal market bill and the issues around that. But will you just start with that big picture, if you like, the kind of continental politics of this?
Sure. I'm somewhat jealous that others have managed to escape Brexit for a few months. I certainly feel as if I haven't managed to leave its orbit, but save perhaps for a couple of weeks in August. But yeah, I'm pleased actually that people are waking up to what is coming down the road. I think in terms of the big picture, we have had a discussion now for what seems like 100 years, but in reality is 4 years, about theoretical changes that may or may not happen. We obviously had a referendum campaign based on a series of ideas about what leaving the European Union could look like. Many of us said it wasn't possible, but nevertheless, those ideas have been floating around for a long time now, and they've been embedded in a lot of people's thinking. And the only comparator that people have to where we are now is, of course, the negotiations over the withdrawal agreement itself. And in that, you have the no deal / deal dilemma. You also, of course, had this unreal expectation of what might come out of that, and the sense that if something were agreed at the end of it, then things would be all right and we could all move on. And of course, the two processes, the withdrawal agreement and the future relationship, are completely different.
Yeah.
And it's no longer possible to simply say, well, as long as something is agreed, then that's fine. We can all move on and our lives can progress accordingly, because we're now in a situation where the theory cannot simply be left hanging as a wonderful thought experiment. Real decisions now have to be made. And it is fundamentally, I think, clear to me that people are not, or certainly haven't reconciled the level of change that will happen now on the 1st of January, irrespective of what is agreed. Services, we talk about not being included in this, and that's absolutely right. By and large, they won't be. There might be an agreement on equivalence for financial services, and that is not the same as passporting, but by and large, services are left untouched by this. Services, of course, represent 80% of the UK economy. Now, there is a long way to go before we have an integrated single market in services, but clearly we are going to be taking a major step back in terms of the largest sector of the UK economy and the largest wealth generator for the UK economy. So that is a significant hit. And I think a lot of companies, a lot of businesses, a lot of trade associations, frankly, think that, well, it'll be okay as long as we have a deal. That will sort all of these things out, won't it? And for some time now, the Commission has been saying, look, you need to get ready for the changes that will happen irrespective. And there have been quite detailed information from the Commission on what will change, what leaving the single market looks like. And the UK government simply hasn't come up with anything equivalent. There is a requirement now for exporters to procure an EORI number, and that is pretty much as far as the government's information campaign has gone. And we are now 4 months from the end of our current trading relationship, and yet there is scant little concrete information for exporters to actually get hold of. And a lot of these changes don't actually depend on the negotiations at the moment, because they're not a function of what the Commission has the power to do. They're a function of leaving the single market. As soon as Theresa May made her speech way back at, I think it was Lancaster House, or on leaving the single market and the customs union, the die was set. And for the whole process, we've had the government pushing back, saying, no, any discussion that there will be negative effects on the UK economy are fear-mongering. And you know, it's simply not realistic to expect those negative impacts. And of course, now here we are at the stage where they're unavoidable.
Well, but Seb, can I I think it's been really useful to establish, as Georgina did right at the top, you know, the fact that this has been going on, but we've now hit the crunch moment. And between you and Marley, I suppose what's really helpful established just quite how much is not on the table in this deal, the sort of prospect of what people call a slim deal or a skinny deal, a goods-focused deal. But even that is a long way from certain. And I suppose I see a number of people, Kim and Paul and others, saying, can we get into the discussion around state aid? And it would just be really helpful to understand, frankly, what is state aid and why are we going to the mattresses, to use Godfather terminology, why are we going to the mattresses over state aid when the UK doesn't seem like an economy to me that is very big on government subsidies for business? What's the, why is this so important? So will you just explain that a little bit and why that's become such a stumbling block?
Yeah, of course. Well, state aid, of course, is the provision of government support for particular sectors or particular companies within a sector to ensure their either survival or indeed competition within an open market. And it's less about the kind of things that you might consider to be state aid, you know, kind of popular big ticket items, such as, you know, support for steel industry, for example, as a historical guide, but actually it covers a whole range of things, including, for example, procurement of public services and the ability for companies to compete for service provision within contracts that are largely managed by the public sector. And you have a situation where, of course, public procurement at the moment is governed by rules that state that if you are a company within the single market and you wish to bid for a service provision in another member state, then you shouldn't be discriminated against on the basis of not coming from the member state where the service is being provided. And you know, on the basis of that discussion, it seems rather obvious that if you leave the single market, you leave the state aid provisions. What the UK, of course, is trying to do is trying to ensure that its companies, its private companies, maintain a level of ability to bid for services within the single market. So the UK, having been integrated within the European economic system for, as Georgina said, 46 years, has obviously got quite good at some of these bids and service provision in other member states. And the prospect of that suddenly ending is obviously something that the government is worried about. When they say they want a simple free trade agreement, which is their top line, and say, you know, surely it's quite reasonable, isn't it, that we want something quite bare bones? The reality is they're asking for something far more comprehensive. And they're asking for effectively elements of the single market protection that we currently have, which cannot be provided. And the biggest problem really that people need to get their heads around is not that we leave the instruments of the single market, therefore we can't seek their protection. It's that we are now at the mercy of each individual member state, and that will have huge implications for UK business, where, for example, in advertising, to take one sector where the UK is particularly good at, any member state would now be well within their rights to withdraw the participation of any UK company seeking to bid for a particular piece of work in that sector. The UK would not have any fallback, whereas of course currently we're covered by single market protection of provisions. So those are the kind of things, and you know, impossible to kind of predict now exactly which sectors and which companies they will affect. But it's the removal of that umbrella level of protection that is the real concern. And there is nothing within these talks that will have any possibility of addressing that.
So thank you. That's really interesting. I know Georgina wants to come back in. Georgina, do you want to make a quick word? Then I'm going to go to Chris and Matt.
Great. Yeah, just a couple of things, I think. We were talking about small businesses and why this might impact them more if we had a no deal. I mean, I think it's not just a question of preparation, it's just the viability of their whole business model. If you're a small company and you produce, say you manufacture, games for children, and then you're thinking, well, okay, so I've got to pay more to be able to export it. I've got to now pay someone to code everything so that the EU has everything to prove that the way that I've manufactured it meets the way that they manufacture goods, that the wood I'm using actually respects environmental standards. It's been, so all sorts of things that you need to code. So you need to get someone to do that. Then you need to pay the transport company because they're going to have to spend time at the border because there'll be checks. So they're going to say, well, it's going to take me much longer to deliver your good. So it's going to be more expensive. So it's actually not in terms of preparation, it's all these additional costs, which we call non-tariff barriers, that make a difference. And then at the end of the day, a company might think, well, it's going to be too costly for me, so I might as well pack up shop rather than continue to produce and export it. Because if I significantly increase the price of my product, no one will buy it. So I think there are real questions for small and medium companies. And that's where, by the way, a deal versus no deal could make a difference, because it's not just about tariffs and quotas, either price to export or import things. It's also about all those non-tariff barriers, making sure that checks can be as limited as possible, finding an agreement to speed up the border process and all of those kinds of things.
Okay, thank you very much. I see there's a debate in the chat about UK SME exports. Just to say to Daniel Don Steinberg, I'm not an expert on these things, but I was told by the Federation of Small Business that although that might be right, the minority of UK small enterprises export, that 90% of the exporters export to the European Union. So make that what you will. Matt, can I ask you just to pick up on where we were talking things through with Seb, particularly about state aid? I don't know whether or not the politics of this are more principle than practice, are more the idea of sovereignty and freedom, or is it really about a new post-Brexit economy, Singapore upon Thames, the chance for a government to really redesign the British economy and wanting to have the freedom to do that?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is that looking at the politics of it, you have to bear in mind, the fact that one of Boris Johnson's many middle names is brinkmanship, and that, he said he was going to die in a ditch on earlier deadline on the withdrawal agreement and missed it. But, then there was a walk with Leah Varadkar in the grounds of a plush Cheshire hotel, and we got a deal. So we have been here before, but the circumstances were very different. It is just worth saying that the cost of a no deal is huge. It would be a failure for him. It would give Keir Starmer the dividing line over Brexit that he's craved, and also a huge headache over what to do with the likely hard border and the consequences for the Good Friday Agreement. However, to get to the question you raised, James, on state aid, that's a really fascinating question that gets us into the sort of, if one is looking for something that might be Johnsonism or Cummingsism, depending on which you believe is more important, there is a definite belief in the heart of this government that the freedom to invest in and give incentives to particularly high-tech industries is fundamental to the future of this country's economy. And so it's a strange mixture of high-tech futurism and economic nationalism. And it was interesting, actually, to hear Rowan Silver, who advised, as you know, George Osborne and David Cameron, was on the radio earlier, saying that that government, the coalition in 2010, had explored the possibilities of propping up, aiding, giving incentives to high tech, and found that the state aid rules imposed by Brussels were an obstruction. So it is this very interesting, strange inversion of what we're used to, which is that, as you say, a lot of Brexiteers want post-Brexit Britain to be a kind of low tax, low regulation, controlled spending Singapore on Thames. But there's also an element of it which wants to be engaged in not, I think, the intervention of the 70s, but certainly to have complete freedom to spend taxpayers' money and offer tax incentives with complete liberty to this imaginary British Silicon Valley, and that is a real and driving force within government. Now, we're a long way from it being a reality, but it is an imperative in these discussions that shouldn't be underestimated, I think.
No, I mean, and it's fascinating in so many ways the way our politics have turned back to front. Last week we were talking about the extent to which the counterculture had become increasingly owned by the right, and just listening to you, Matt, you can't help but reflect that there's more of an urgency for picking winners on the right now in the economy than there is historically on the left. But I think Seb's point, which Seb I hadn't really appreciated before, that actually European Union membership gave UK companies protections vis-a-vis state aid if they wanted to bid for business elsewhere on the within the market. I hadn't really appreciated that, so it's going to rebound. I'm going to come back to some of these issues in a moment, but I would really like to ask Chris Cook to tell me what he makes of it. Chris, if you remember, wrote a long piece for us earlier in the last year, which was essentially how Brexit had defeated the government, or at least found the British government out. Chris, what do you make of where we are?
So I think there are two risks in trying to sort of parse what the government is doing. The first is we basically always assume there's a sort of rational plan, or that the plan is at the least, if it may be rational, and it's probably well evidenced, we probably assume. And I think you have to sort of take a step back and sort of look at who's actually making these decisions, because I don't think there's not really a serious economist working in Downing Street at the moment, right? There's not a real plan for this stuff. And anyone who do any of the arithmetic about the cost benefit analysis they're sort of thinking through, you can't balance the two sides of the equation. So there's not a universe in which the right to offer more state aid is plausibly worth basically any medium-term increase in border friction. It's definitely not worth any increase in friction on the island of Ireland. And so I think we have to sort of accept that there's like a danger in sort of just reporting what politicians say and not scrutinizing the fact that it can't, in this case, make sense. Like it's nuts. And when you talk to officials about it, when you push them on this stuff, they're like, yeah, but they're mental. That's they're nuts. Like they have a view about the way that the world should run, and they're determined to push it through. And you shouldn't call it ideological either. It's just like it's sort of an idée fixe that they sort of picked up.
Well, I was going to say, Chris, I've got some sympathy with it because I think it's not ideological. I think it's delusional. And the reason I think it's that way is I sat in St James's Park last week with one of those people that you'd described. And one of the things they pointed out to me, which I just wasn't aware of, which was that under the terms of the transition agreement, under the terms of the withdrawal agreement, the nature of the provisions around Northern Ireland mean that any UK-wide state subsidy, any UK-wide state aid, i.e. that touches anything in Northern Ireland, is subject to EU jurisdiction because of the nature of the agreement over Northern Ireland. And it was just a complete bolt out of the blue to me. I just didn't realise that was the case.
I think
I just wonder whether, when you did your piece, I remember I had this sort of light bulb moment when you came and produced the first draft of your piece. It was like, oh my God, we've just forgotten Ireland. And I wonder whether that's what's happening again now.
So I think it's that they fundamentally, they don't understand, sort of rather they feel that the island of Ireland is the tail wagging the dog, right, in this stuff. As opposed to, I'm a Roman Catholic Londoner, right? I remember my childhood was ringing Dad up to check he hadn't been killed, right, every time the bomb went off. And, I have ethnic sympathy, but they don't seem to have sort of have taken that into their sort of souls in the way that you kind of have to if you run the British state. The other thing about this stuff though is if you go through the one of the things that like 10 years ago, the joke about state aid was you could do anything, right? Like it was not these are not enormously tough provisions. So we got Hinkley Point through. Hinkley Point is a massive piece of state aid. But you know, because it's green energy infrastructure, that gets through. I think Taranto, there's a huge steel plant in Italy which got completely renovated by the Italian state, and it was state aid. You know, obviously it was state aid, but they managed to get it through because they were marginally reducing the amount of carbon emissions for each lump of pointless steel that we don't need them to make that they made. The state aid provisions are not very strong. There are carve-outs for whole industries. There are carve-outs for tech in particular, well, for primary research in particular. There are carve-outs for transport. There are carve-outs for defense. If you want to do something that isn't just picking winners and distorting, basically, you can do it. The other thing about all this stuff is, I think one of the things that's under scrutinized. So see, Daniel has been talking in the comments about like trying to build a sort of tech hub. I think you have to realize that so I just went and looked at so the University of California gets about $3 billion a year in federal grants for, to do local research, right? These are sums that are relatively trivial in the US context. That is one public university in the San Francisco area doing bits of research. That is a tiny portion of the research infrastructure that they built in the US. When you sort of think through what we spend on research and what we could plausibly spend on research, you realize that we are always going to be the division, like the championship is in this game, right? We are never going to be able to build a research infrastructure that's bigger than a country that's much richer than us per capita and much larger than us, right? And there's a good question about whether it is worth even competing to be second place if people are always going to want to try to get out from us to the place where the riches are much bigger. The question is whether we can...
But then all of that, Chris, would suggest...
is worth it, or whether the tournament nature of pay and the fact that people always want to be in the biggest market will mean that we always lose people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It is massively under scrutinized that what we may end up doing, if we do massively ramp up, to say, let's say we end up on population terms as bigger a spend on research in the US, which would obviously be much larger in GDP terms, there is a chance that all we will do is bleed money into other states,
right?
Particularly the US, because we'll just offer free subsidy. Israel's quite a good example of a place which boasts a lot about its tech sector, and it's, I think it's better for prestige and for the reputation of the IDF as a sort of place to make businesses than it perhaps is as an economic force for Israel, because it loses people as soon as they reach a certain size.
Chris, thank you. There are a bunch of people who've made comments in the chat. I want to see if I can bring them in. I'm going to start with Mark Dempsey because, well, you're in Berlin and you're an hour ahead of us. How do things look, Mark, a little closer to the deadline?
Morning all, firstly. Congratulations, James, on this platform. It's very useful. From Berlin, there's a level of incredulity, particularly with the headlines from yesterday. But at the same time, I think they realize this is all part of a wider negotiation strategy. Obviously, in Berlin, Brexit is not a major issue. I think they know that there's going to be a level of gamesmanship up until very late. And the Navalny issue is dominating the headlines here, and whether Nord Stream will be postponed or not. So I think everyone's expecting, I suppose, given your Prime Minister's record over the last couple of months, that this was always going to end up being the way it is. But I would also add that the Northern Irish issue is not something that the EU is going to compromise on. And I think, as I said, Pelosi and the US Congress have said that in order to have a decent trade deal with the US, the Good Friday Agreement can't be compromised. And I think this gets missed in between the lines sometimes from the UK. And the EU is very united on this. And there was a lot of work put in, as Georgina, I think, will probably speak to, into each individual member state in advance of all the Brexit agreements. So that's pretty much what I've got to
Mark,
add.
That's really interesting and really helpful. And actually, one of the things that's striking here, that I think one of the criticisms that's made of UK politics and media, is that we've never really got our heads into where people in the capitals of other European countries are. So just the Navalny Nord Stream point is, is really, really significant. Thank you very much. I'm going to, if I can, Peter Flynn and Steve Byrne, I just want to pick up on the point that Mark just finished with there about Northern Ireland and Ireland. Peter, do you want to weigh in? I suppose you were making the point that that I was trying to make to Chris, that we tend to forget Ireland in this conversation.
Yeah, my view is that, and it's been cited in the chat, that the sort of, whatever the agreement turns out to be, Brexit is almost incompatible with the Good Friday Agreement. And I suppose the interesting thing in terms of Conservative and Unionist party unity, which has always, it seems to me, over the last 5 years been held at an incredibly high priority in the expense of other things. Mm. It's almost the ultimate betrayal of the Unionists. They really have been sort of betrayed if we go along a least worst option is a border in the Irish Sea. So in so many different ways, the intractable problem of the island of Ireland and Northern Ireland as part of this whole proposition still hasn't been resolved, and ultimately could be one of the most fractious things that is dealt with, aside from the various trade agreements and whatever the withdrawal agreement or no deal or transitional, free trade comes up with.
Okay, Peter, thanks. And I'm going to pick up, I don't know whether you saw Steve Burns' comment in the chat, as well as making me jealous that he'd got to an Eminem concert. He raised an interesting point about, I suppose, Steve, not that you're going to get stopped at customs checks, but that there's a psychological reminder there. Do you want to just talk about what impact you think those border checks, if they were put in place, would have? Steve, you there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just anecdotally, I mentioned that I remember growing up because I grew up in Dublin, but my mother's family were from Donegal. So both of those counties are in the Republic, but the quickest way to get there is through the north. So we were always growing up being stopped at the border checks and questioned by British soldiers, even up until 2003, going down from Donegal to Dublin and a British soldier just putting his hand up and stopping our car to ask. And, it's a weird thing to have to grow up with. There's not many people in European countries that have to explain where they're going to soldiers. And granted, I don't think we're necessarily going to see immediately such security checks on the borders again, because mostly this conversation is about customs. But I think it can't be taken for granted how important it is not to have normality when you're traveling between. I mean, we here in Ireland see the difference between Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland. There's a difference between England and Scotland. And I know that we're not in the same jurisdiction and all that, but just psychologically to help with the peace process, it has made a huge difference. And it's not that the British media or the British people are ignoring it. I just think they think we're using it as a negotiation tactic, but it's so much more fundamental to the well-being of the citizens on the island on both sides of the borders that we just try and keep it as normal as possible, and that be remembered when the negotiations are going on.
Okay. Well, thank you, Steve. I think it's really helpful. I'm going to can I come to Kim Barker, because Kim, I'm just interested in how you read what's going to happen here.
Thank you. I should just point out my name's actually Ed Barker. I've logged in under my wife's Zoom account, so in case you're wondering there. I think the point I was looking to make was on tariffs. This year, the government revised its external global tariff policy and amended it heavily from last year. And as a result of that, as a default, we've got replicated tariffs to the EU on products. For me, no deal is a lot less likely because unless a tariff agreement is reached, simply because I cannot fathom in any way how we would be able to reciprocate the current tariff policy in place on all goods, from food products in particular, but across the board, because of the costs that were placed on domestic customers, given that Brexit is about providing benefits to UK consumers. I fail to see how the two can be aligned in any way whatsoever. Last year, tariffs were set much lower across the board, sometimes to zero and sometimes at reduced rates from the EU. This year, that hasn't been, it's now been fully reciprocated. And that's why I think no deal is less of a chance this year than it did last year.
Yeah. I mean, there is just also a practical, I mean, someone's explained to me just the practical difficulties of moving from a world where you can, if you're a business, send a package to Birmingham as easily as Barcelona, just how you're actually going to rewire those things. Ed, thank you very much. I'm gonna. I know there's a sort of, not exactly raging, but certainly simmering argument about the extent to which we can fire up our tech sector. I want to come to that in a moment, if I can bring in Daniel Doll-Steinberg and Matt Ballantyne. But Kushla, you raise, and I'm going to put this to Marley Morris actually, the question about immigration and the extent to which the UK opens up, the extent to which, frankly, people are going to want to be coming to the UK. Maybe I'm inferring too much by your comment. What were you thinking?
No, you're absolutely not inferring too much at all. I mean, I moved to the UK in my early 20s, a while ago now. And I'll be honest with you, one of the reasons I moved to the UK was the fact that it was open to Europe and the possibilities that that unlocked for me. And I think now, if I were starting out again, I don't think I'd come to London. It doesn't seem like an attractive option anymore. I would go to Berlin, I'd possibly go to New York, but London, relatively speaking, is sliding down the attractiveness scale. And I speak to a number of people back home, which is New Zealand. And again, it's, well, why would we, rather than, of course we will, attitude.
Mm-hmm. And so do you think that, I mean, actually sort of the politics of immigration are going to reverse, that we're going to be finding ourselves, because there is a question, and this sort of intersects with COVID, doesn't it? The extent to which people have left the UK in the last 6 months, and whether or not they're going to be shortages of labour, not just specialist skills.
I think there'll certainly be shortages of labour, but to be honest with you, I think even your question, James, is slightly naive. It talks about immigration in the UK context and from a UK point of view. Right. There's a rest of the world out there, and we're looking at the UK. Yeah. And we're making our own opinions and judgments.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm smiling because I was reminded, someone said to me, I think 2011-12, I said, how do you think we're doing? And they said, it only matters by comparison with how badly everybody else is doing. And now we may be the opposite of that. Kushla, thanks very much. I said I was going to try and bring in Daniel and Matt on the tech question. I see that Tim Rawlins is also touching on it. Matt Bantine, if you're there, I'm confused. What do you think? Is there a capacity for government to intervene effectively on this front?
If you look at the Silicon Valley model, there's obviously, as people have been talking in the chat, there's a lot of money going into R&D in education institutions. The traditional route for R&D investment was through defence spending.
Yes.
The modern Silicon Valley startup world, I'm increasingly the view isn't what it is on the tin. It's an investment vehicle for venture capital, and actually most of what comes out of it either is bought up by bigger companies and is just amalgamated into Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft's products, or is bought by them and then left to die.
But doesn't that, Matt, wouldn't that suggest that Chris's point is right, is that, you know, what he describes as the tournament nature of pay, or if you like, the concentrations of free market capital in the US and in China for that matter, mean that, you know, the government's idea or the ambitions that it's going to be able to pump prime a rival tech sector in the UK is a bit naive.
No, absolutely. And the thing is that I can see this turning into then subsidising startups that should be failing. Right. I'm not a big believer in the Schumpeterian, you know, creative destruction or whatever it was he talked about. But the way the tech startup sector works is it's massively inefficient.
Right.
But it's got massive returns for investors on the things that are successful, and those returns mostly come from an exit by being acquired by a bigger tech company.
Right. Right.
The one big global thing that we had, Arm,
yes,
we let go, and then we let it go to what appears to be a massively weird, corrupt organisation, SoftBank, which is a world of pain itself. Yeah. But nothing else that we've got. There's not a single global tech brand. There might be sort of niche stuff around R&D, which is a valuable thing to have, but we're not going to compete with America. It's just not. It's not viable.
Not that way. Daniel, I don't know whether you're there. Dolph Steinberg, are you there? Because I think you've been making, if I'm right, the other argument. Are you there, Daniel? I might have missed you. We lost him. All right. Well, in which case, can I sort of go back to Georgina and Marley and Seb as we come towards the end of the hour? Seb, can you do one thing for us, which is just talk about if you like, the mood music in Europe. Let's assume that we do either a slim or no deal, and specifically a no deal. what does that imperil in terms of next steps, i.e. future parts of negotiations with the EU, or for that matter, future trade deals?
Well, I'm glad you talked about next steps, because ultimately, wherever we end up with this, it's not going to be an end point, you know, for the next 20, 25 years. There's going to have to be a development in one direction or another, because it's where we are headed with certainly a no deal, but even a slim deal, and those are the only two options, you know, that we have at present. It's not sustainable given the level of integration that the UK has with the European market. I mean, you know, put broadly, there is a lot of disappointment among our immediate neighbours. I mean, obviously, there's the initial feeling that actually the referendum result was the rejection of a key alliance, and that's an important point that we really don't talk very much about. The European Union is not just a single market and an economic arrangement, and of course, you know, it is about values and about a place in the world as well. And that rejection, I think, was felt very keenly. Nonetheless, you know, obviously over the last few years, there has been an attempt to not just accept that decision, but also to try and find an accommodation with it that includes the UK in the European family of nations. And I think increasingly there's a sort of sense that the UK is simply not interested in being part of that family of nations, however distant that relationship is. If you just look at an objective way of looking at the ways in which European countries are governed, we would be the only major European economy outside the European ecosystem. You know, there are basically two ecosystems in Europe. There's the EU ecosystem, and then there's Russia. There is no other kind of ecosystem that enables a European economy to flourish and to integrate and to trade with its neighbours. And that's why I think ultimately where we're heading is completely unsustainable. And there would have to be some accommodation and further negotiations down the road in order to get us back into some of the things that we are rejecting at the moment. And those negotiations are going to be very complicated, but they will rely on good faith. And the move to sort of overwrite the withdrawal agreement with domestic legislation, and there are so many strands we could go down on this, Northern Ireland being the most obvious one, but there are so many strands that we could go down on why this is a bad idea, not least in terms of our international reputation for other deals with other countries. But that single move, I think, highlights a fear that is felt within other European capitals, that basically the UK is not an honest negotiation partner. I think that is our biggest hurdle at the moment, that people don't trust us.
Yeah, and I suppose the really interesting thing is sooner or later, in some form or other, we're going to have judicial issues, national security issues, environmental issues. I mean, a whole range of things we're going to have to discuss. So it doesn't end here. And presumably also said there are these questions about the ease with which we're going to be able to do US trade deals, Japan trade deals, etc. And those are also contingent on this. So, well, listen, thank you. I'm Marley, can I just come to you also for a last word? What do you think are, in particular, just to pick up on Kushler's point, the implications for the kind of country we live in terms of openness and immigration, and emigration for that matter?
Well, I think it's important, I suppose, to first note that net EU migration has fallen quite considerably since the referendum. It then, I think a lot of EU migrants have actually left the UK based on the latest Labour Force survey data in the last few months due to the pandemic. And we haven't actually changed our immigration system yet. We still have free movement of people. So when we actually introduce the new immigration system and significantly restrict EU migration and impose quite considerable new controls on EU migration, I think it will mean that over the longer term there will be a much lower level of migration from the EU. It's right to say that the government has, to some extent, also opened up non-EU migration. It's introducing a new post-study work visa. It's actually reducing some of the restrictions on non-EU migration, for instance, reducing the salary threshold and the skills threshold for work visas. So in some respects, I think it is actually delivering to some extent on what the Vote Leave said during the campaign, which was control EU migration, but have a slightly more liberalised policy on non-EU migration. But overall, for EU citizens, it'll be a lot harder to come to the UK.
Marley, interesting. Thank you. Georgina, a last word from you too. Can I do the really unfair thing to you, which is, okay, so what is going to happen?
Yeah, that is unfair, but it's a fair question, let's put it that way. Look, it's really difficult to say. I think my starting point is always, as long as both sides want a deal, that's what we should work with. And I think, the Prime Minister had a call with Macron yesterday, and they did cover Brexit, right? They did cover the future negotiation. So in a negotiation, trade negotiation, usually they begin once both parties have had years and years of preparatory work, informal talks. None of that happened this time round. And the second point is a trade negotiation is usually a destination towards less friction, whereas now we are kind of bringing back friction. So the destination point is very different from a traditional trade negotiation, and that makes it very complicated. What's the key to a successful outcome? I would say know your negotiator, or know who you're negotiating with, know where you're going, and prepare for all eventualities, which means that if you are threatening to walk away, at least you can credibly demonstrate that you can weather that storm. So I think when it comes to the EU, they certainly want a deal, and they will not be the ones to walk away. They know that they're negotiating with this government, and that this government has a very different view of what it wants than, say, Theresa May did. But they're also thinking long term. This idea around sort of subsidies and state aid and all the rest of it, that was because at the very beginning, the EU said, look, if you want to retain similar levels of access to a market, you either abide by similar rules, or we agree a system that allows us to manage that divergence before it becomes a problem, so that we ensure that we don't just rely on traditional trade remedies, because those could take months and months to resolve. And then we've got delays, and we've got disruption in trade, and that's not good for anything. The problem is the UK government says, well, we want to strike our own rules, and we don't really want a governance system, a way to manage that divergence, because that means that we would be bound in too much with you. So there's a real question there about where you're going and what your ultimate destination point is, and how do you manage that. But finally, I'd say, at the end of the day, it will come down to what Prime Minister thinks is the best, and what is the greatest political cost. Is it accepting some things he might not have wanted, but in a view that actually you can build on that basic agreement and you can change it in time? Or is it a clean break, but then with the hope that whenever you do return to the negotiating table, you can pick up where you left off? And I think that's the one thing you hear in EU capitals, is if that were to happen, they would have probably a much more rigid mandate than they already have. So I think they're still committed to a deal. So I think that should be where we're headed, but there'll be lots of chest beating before now and the end of the year.
Well, Georgina, thank you very much. Funnily enough, by the halfway through the hour as we were listening, I was getting more and more despondent thinking about different elements of this, and probably by the end of it, I'd come to your point. I will offer a very quick summary on what I've heard. In a thinking, what we try to do is make sure that we're informed by all the voices we've heard in the course of the hour. And the thing that's been really useful for me is listening to this. It's clear that we are at 5 to midnight, as we all know, but we're essentially in a choice between no deal and a very slim deal, a very skinny deal, one that we should appreciate excludes vast parts of the economy to start with. And even that seems to be imperiled by something, the state aid debate, which when you look at it more closely is even more bewildering than when you look at it from a distance, in the sense that listening to Chris and Matt and others, the arguments around state aid don't really make sense given the carve-outs that Chris mentioned, and given the limits on what public investment can do for sectors like tech that Matt Ballantyne was just talking about. So it's an odd stumbling block. The bigger ones, it seems, are the ones that were touched on by people like Steve and Peter around Ireland, and that Mark Dempsey mentioned from Berlin, which are about really different agendas, big geopolitical agendas. And I suppose in the end, that's the reason I come back to your point at the end, Georgina, thinking actually it must be the case that the impetus, and Matt D'Ancona made this point, I thought, really clearly, that the impetus for a deal is really much more than the government is currently admitting, in the sense that they own a political failure if they don't get one, and they own really difficult and fractious geopolitical relationships if they don't get one. And so you're right, there may be quite a lot of talk about a quote-unquote good outcome. It's clear that the better outcome is a deal, even a slim one. So it's begun to make a little more sense. I know there's a good deal more to discuss on this, and in fact, we're going to probably have an open news meeting on a Tuesday. Today, we're going to be discussing three big questions. One is whether we should lock down again now. Another is whether Extinction Rebellion is right to disrupt the presses, and the third is state aid worth the fight? So we'll try and dig a little further into that at lunchtime, and so we hone our thinking. But for this morning, a big thank you to Georgina Wright of the Institute for Government, Marley Morris of ippr, and Seb Dance. Thank you everyone for joining. Thanks to my colleagues Matt and Chris as well. A really useful, I was glad I got up early, it was really well worth it. Thanks very much. We can't thank you or applaud you, but we can wave and wish ourselves luck. Have a good day, everyone.